Okay, we are recording. Jeremy, why don't you go ahead and get started?
All right, great. Thank you, Stephanie. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the next installment of our continuing video series on COVID-19 vaccine information. This afternoon, we're very pleased to bring you an edition that's going to focus for a physician audience some of the frequently asked questions that we've been getting in conversation and hallway dialogue. So if we go to the next slide, we'll introduce our panel. I'm very pleased, to be joined this afternoon by Heather Klaus, who is the Senior Associate Dean of Faculty Affairs, Professor of Medicine, and Program Director for Infectious Diseases Fellowship Program at the Lewis Katz School of Medicine at Temple University. Also joining us this afternoon is Daniel Miller, who is Assistant Professor of Clinical Medicine and the Program Director of the Internal Medicine Residency at the Lewis Katz School of Medicine at Temple University. And finally, a familiar face around Fox Chase Cancer Center and on a lot of these COVID-19 panels, Dr. Glenn Rall, who is the Professor and Chief Academic Officer at Fox Chase Cancer Center and the co-author of Principles of Virology, which is the definitive textbook on the science. It's now in its 5th edition. And I'm Jeremy Moore. I'm a member of the COVID-19 Vaccine Communications Task Force, and I'm very proud to be moderating this panel this afternoon. We're going to kick it off with some opening remarks from Dr. Klaus. So if we can go to the next slide, Dr. Klaus, you can take it away.
Thanks, Jeremy. I want to first say thank you to you, Jeremy, and Stephanie Murphy, and everyone from marketing, and everyone who helped put this together. And also a huge thanks to Tony Reed and Dwight McBee, and literally so many others for all their advocacy for vaccination for our staff and physicians and employees, and for standing up a really incredible and efficient vaccine clinic so quickly. I think it's a huge achievement, and really proud to be a Temple ID doc during this entire pandemic, and especially these last few weeks of hope that we've been seeing. So I want to first just briefly touch on the historic timeline of how fast everything has happened. Can you scroll up, Stephanie, that slide so that we can see the arrow at the bottom? Thanks. Okay. The genome for SARS-CoV-2 was sequenced in January of 2020, and it's remarkable that here we are in December 2020 administering vaccine to our employees. You can see the timeline moves through the first trial in March, and the first phase 3 testing done in May, and the first efficacy results from Pfizer in early November. And now here we are in December, and there's 2 vaccines that we're going to discuss in detail that have EUAs from the FDA. Next slide, please. So, as you know, there's a lot of platforms that vaccines are based upon, and the same is true for SARS-CoV-2. There are many in preclinical development, and as you go forward through the phases of development, you can see that there is a mix of platforms that are being used. I'll focus on phase 2, 3, and phase 3. There's some company names there and multiple types of platforms that are part of this phase. Next slide, please. We're going to focus on the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, both of whom had their initial EUAs granted within the last week and a half. So these slides are hot off the presses. Next slide. So only one of the trials has been published. And so the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine trial was published in the New England Journal in December 2020, showing here table 1 purely to say that the vaccine arm and the placebo arm were very similar in these areas. And to point out the racial and ethnic distribution, about 83% white, 9% Black, and 28% Hispanic or Latinx ethnicity. Folks that had elevated body mass indexes were equal across the arms. Next slide, please. And so getting right to it, as you've heard, and as is well publicized, they had an outstanding efficacy for their vaccine. In the placebo arm, there were 162 cases of symptomatic COVID-19. In the vaccine arm, there were only 8. And when it comes to severe COVID-19, defined by tachycardia, tachypnea, and fever, as well, or ARDS, or need for mechanical ventilation, or hypotension, there were 9 cases in the placebo arm and 1 case in the vaccine arm. And so this led to a very pretty graph that you can see here for the outstanding efficacy of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. Next slide, please. And so since 2020 wouldn't be complete without a meme, I found this one and I had to put it in, which is basically, you should always try in your studies to get data that's good enough that you don't need to do statistics in order to prove a difference. And I think that you can see here that the, the Pfizer-BioNTech graph meets this criteria. Next slide, please. So I want to talk for a second about the side effects of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. So very immunogenic vaccine, which is great. And there's basically, the groups were divided into ages under 55 years old and over 55 years old. And those over 55 years old across the board had less side effects, lower percentage of side effects than the younger folks. And that comes including local reaction and pain, fatigue, headache, and fever. I think that the local reaction is far and away the most common: pain, redness, soreness of the arm. Fatigue is the next most common systemic side effect, 60%, 50 to 60% fatigue. We saw about 40 to 50% headache in these folks and 10 to 15% of fever. Next slide, please. There were a couple adverse effects that they published on in the trial, and there was some degree of trend towards increased lymphadenopathy, 64 cases versus 6 in the placebo. There were 4 adverse effects. You can see them noted here. And Bell's palsy, there were 4 cases versus 0 in the placebo arm. And we're going to talk about that in a little more detail in the questions, so I'll leave sort of more comment on that for that section. There was 0 anaphylaxis in the trial. There have been 2 cases, though, on public vaccination in the UK. And as of Saturday, 6 cases in the United States after 271,000 doses given. I think many more hundreds of thousands of doses have been given as of this morning. So I think the rate still remains low. Next slide, please. And so as of Friday, Moderna's vaccine had its EUA approved by the FDA. The trial is not yet published, so what I'm going to review here is data from the FDA documents and ACIP recommendations. This was approved in ages 18 and older, unlike Pfizer, which was approved in 16 and older. Again, 2 doses, same as Pfizer, but this one is given day 1 and day 28 versus Pfizer's day 1 and 21. And one of the exciting things about the Moderna vaccine is its storage qualities. It can be stored at a normal freezer temperature. It's stable at refrigerator temperatures for 30 days, safe at room temperature once it's been warmed up for 12 hours. So I think these qualities make it a little easier for sites to distribute. It's also an mRNA platform similar to the Pfizer vaccine. And the data for its efficacy, though I don't have a pretty graph to show you, would be the same pretty graph. There were 185 cases of symptomatic COVID in the placebo arm and 11 cases in the vaccine arm for an efficacy of 94%. For this vaccine, severe COVID cases defined similarly, there were 30 cases in the placebo arm, 1 case in the vaccine arm for vaccine efficacy to prevent severe COVID of 97%. Next slide, please. The demographics, again, from the FDA documents shown here, just to say, similar in these facets, about 80% white participants, about 10% Black participants, and 20%, 21% Hispanic Latinx ethnicities. And they included a BMI mean in their data, which was 29. Next slide, please. So in terms of the side effects of the vaccine for the Moderna vaccine, again, very immunogenic vaccine. Local reactions are the most common, greater in those folks under 65. They used a different age cutoff for their data analysis versus those over 65. You can see a slight increase in all of these effects after the 2nd dose of the vaccine, which makes biologic sense. And they grouped it into any systemic reaction overall. So about 60% for the 1st dose, 80% for the 2nd dose for those under 65, and about 50% 1st dose and 70% 2nd dose for those over 65. Fever was the only one that they called out in the FDA documents. I'm hoping more data will be published in the trial for us to all look at. Next slide. And in terms of the comments they made on lymphadenopathy, they did note that there was a fair amount of lymphadenopathy in the ipsilateral arm where the vaccine was given, and not much of it was very severe, and most of it abated within a week. There were 3 cases of Bell's palsy in the vaccine arm and 1 case in the placebo arm. And for anaphylaxis, there were 0 cases in the Moderna trial, and public vaccination is pending. So we're not sure, really what is going to be the case when that starts officially, probably today or tomorrow. Next slide. I think that's it for my slide. So Jeremy, thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Klaus, for that very thorough overview. For the balance of our time together, what we're going to do is we're going to go through some questions that were submitted to the group on SurveyMonkey and also just prepared in advance. And once we're done with those advanced questions, we will go ahead and solicit questions from the group. Reminder to the group participants to please keep your microphones on mute. Questions will be submitted through chat and we'll read them to our panelists. So the first question, when a vaccine is injected into your arm, what happens? And Glenn, we're going to kick this one to you first to kind of give us the visual of what happens when, I think in your words, the vaccine gets squirted into your arm.
All right, thank you, Jeremy. So I think there's a lot of hesitancy and anxiety about the mRNA vaccines in particular because they're new. There's concerns that people feel that they were rushed. And so I think it's important, even though I suspect most of you on the call are generally aware of what goes on, to just walk through the very relatively few number of steps of what happens between the injection and an ultimately successful vaccine reaction. So the mRNA in both the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines is the mRNA that encodes the spike glycoprotein. This is the surface protein that interacts with the ACE2 receptor that allows the access of the virus into cells. It's just the RNA. And so these RNAs are packaged in little lipid particles, like little oil droplets, that do 2 things. First, they protect the RNA because RNA is extraordinarily labile. It gets degraded very, very rapidly and easily. That may be a good chunk of the reason why keeping these vaccines cold is so important. But the other thing that the little lipid particle does is it makes the RNA look tasty to a cell because like the plasma membrane of a cell, it's very lipid rich. So what will end up happening is following an injection into the arm, these lipid particles will get engulfed by cells locally. And in the cytoplasm, which is where all proteins are where all RNAs are translated into proteins, is where this RNA, like any of the other cellular RNAs, will be turned into a functional protein, in this case, the spike glycoprotein, the coronavirus spike. That protein will presumably be secreted or presented on the surface of that infected cell. And that will be the catalyst for antigen presenting cells, such as dendritic cells, for example, to gobble up the spike protein, to migrate to lymph nodes and to initiate the whole cascade that we associate with induction of a protective host response. So the RNA itself, I presume, is going to be degraded within probably 24 to 48 hours following injection. It's extraordinarily labile. What we are hoping is that you provided enough opportunity for that RNA to be, in a sense, turned into or serve as the code for the spike protein that ultimately is the immunogen.
Dan, Heather, do you guys have anything to add to that? That seemed to cover the gamut. All right, then we'll go ahead and move to the next question. Next slide, please. So what if accidental mixing of the 2 regimens occurs? And we're talking about Pfizer and Moderna because that's what we have available right now. What happens, accidental mixing? Is that something we should be concerned about?
So, I mean, I would say the companies advise against doing that, and Temple is doing everything that it can to keep excellent records. Everyone's getting a vaccine card with very clearly stated manufacturer so that when you come back for your second dose, at that time, there will be both Pfizer and Moderna vaccine very likely circulating around Temple or around wherever you're getting vaccinated. And so the advice is to advise against doing that. But if it were to happen, you should not restart the series or give a 3rd shot of the original company's vaccine that you got. There's not a lot of data around what happens after 3rd doses. And so the ACIP advises to not give a 3rd dose and accept that you got 2 doses of hopefully very similar vaccines, but to not give the 3rd dose.
That's right, Heather. And then the same on the same vein of that, the concern for adverse effects by mixing the two, we haven't seen anything that would make me suggest that there would be any additional concern over it, given how similar they are in structure and form. I don't think there'll be any higher risk for side effects than what was reported by Heather earlier.
I do want to mention one thing though, that we should separate vaccination with any other vaccine by 14 days from the COVID-19 vaccine. So if we're still not up to date on our influenza shot, you have to get your influenza vaccine 14 days apart from your COVID-19 vaccine.
And that's any vaccine, not just the influenza shot, Heather?
That's any vaccine.
Okay. Because it occurs to me that for our physician audience, that may be relevant to the patients who may have other vaccines on their schedule. All right, so let's move to the next question then. Can I get the vaccine if I've previously had COVID?
I can actually start with just a quick science thing here, and then I'll defer to Heather and to Dan on this. So it might seem like a waste of a vaccine to give it to somebody who's already had COVID, because the presumption would be those individuals already have mounted an immune response. They've cleared the infection, or they've controlled the infection. So therefore, why would you now, on top of what was already presumably a successful host response, give another vaccine? And I think the reasons for this are that we're still trying to understand the natural biology of this virus. But what we do know is that individuals who are infected naturally with SARS, that ultimately causes the disease COVID, have very variable levels of neutralizing antibodies, right? So whether that is directly correlated to the severity of the case that you've had or not, I think is going to be determined over time. It seems that there is some connection between individuals that have a lighter case of COVID having lower neutralizing antibody titers. What level of neutralizing antibody is sufficient, or any of the memory immune cells that are generated as well, what level is necessary to generate a protective immune response that's going to be a durable response isn't yet known. One of the benefits of the vaccine are that you're getting a constant dose of the RNA, presumably therefore a constant dose of the immunogenic protein, and that dose we know does provide durable over multi-months sort of protection. So this is the reason why it makes sense for individuals who've, even if they've been previously exposed, to still go ahead and get the vaccine regimen. Heather, you concur there?
I do, absolutely. I would say that folks who had symptomatic COVID were excluded from both the Pfizer and Moderna trials. But I would say that there's no evidence to suggest from the data that there were worse reactions to the vaccine in folks who had had previous COVID. And I would say, from a practical matter, you should defer vaccination, any vaccination, while you're symptomatic with a febrile illness, whether that's COVID or non-COVID. So I would say that if you have a febrile illness or you're concerned you have COVID, you should wait until after you've completed your quarantine period to get the vaccine.
So it sounds like you're saying there is no data on reactogenicity to the vaccine in people who have had symptomatic COVID-19, because they were all excluded from the trials. My understanding of the J&J trial that we're doing here does not exclude people with prior history of COVID-19. Is that correct?
The trial excluded folks with symptomatic COVID. I think there was some, I mean, there may have been some people who were antibody positive, but not symptomatic.
Correct. Yeah, there was a significant number that had antibodies that were positive for COVID in this trial.
All right, great. So we see that a lot of chat questions are coming in, and so we're going to go back to the pre-prepared questions. And if you see your question come up on the pre-prepared ones, we'll have them all organized by the end of this talk. So what about immunocompromised healthcare workers or healthcare workers with autoimmune diseases? Should they get the vaccine?
So I can start with that, and I'll get this is first of all, I will say that whenever these types of things come out, it's very difficult to parse out, for instance, if somebody, how many people in the trials may have had conditions that would have been considered immunocompromising. And there are so many different variations, as you guys know, as I see some of the physicians on here that take care of patients who are immunocompromised, what different varying degrees there are of this, right? So of course, any decision that a patient's going to make should be one that they have a conversation with you about. That being said, typically the risk for the patient in the case of a vaccine that doesn't have any live component is a similar risk in terms of side effects to others. In fact, sometimes those with weaker immune systems will have fewer side effects from vaccines. The challenge actually sometimes comes with the effectiveness of the vaccine, not so much with the safety of getting it, but how protective it can be. And a lot of those questions, we just don't know the answers to.
Yeah,
Right,
Dan, I think that's right. I mean, I think that the comorbidities that were publicly included in the trial were stable HIV and stable hepatitis C, at least in the Pfizer trial that I was able to review all the details of. They didn't mention other comorbidities necessarily in their data, but they didn't necessarily exclude folks unless they had a sort of severe immunocompromising illness. But the definitions were not as clear because it's a heterogeneous group, as Dan pointed out.
All right, let's go ahead and move to the next question then. Next slide, please. What is the impact of pre-existing allergies on my ability or my patient's ability to get vaccinated? This is a question that a lot of patients have been asking their doctors. So what's the advice there?
I can take the first stab at this. So the concern about anaphylaxis, I think, has gotten a lot of press. There were no cases of anaphylaxis in either the Pfizer nor Moderna trials. Once public vaccination began with the Pfizer vaccine, there were small amounts of cases of anaphylaxis. And the first thing I would say is if you have an anaphylactic or severe allergic reaction to the first dose, it's recommended by ACIP that you not get the second dose. I think that makes a great deal of sense. And the concern, I think, we're not sure exactly what the allergen is. We're thinking it's not the exact mRNA. It's potentially the polyethylene glycol in the lipid nanoparticle that Glenn was talking about, the oil drop that may be the source of some of the allergic reactions that folks are having. And so the statement by the ACIP, which is at this point what I'm going to cite, is that if there is a history of severe allergic reaction to a vaccine or to other injectable therapy, so IM, IV, or sub-Q, you should kind of analyze the risk-benefit ratio for you with the COVID vaccine. However, for people who have food allergies, oral medication allergies, antibiotic allergies, latex allergies, seasonal allergies, all of those folks should proceed and get vaccinated without concern.
Dan or Glenn, did you want to add anything to that?
Other
In
than
terms
agreeing,
of, oh, sorry, go ahead, Glenn. Sorry.
nope, just I agree with Heather.
On the receiving end, what Temple is doing as in our vaccination campaign and what others are doing around the country is monitoring everybody for symptoms for at least 15 minutes after receiving the vaccination to make sure that there's no anaphylactoid reaction, and epinephrine's on site at the moment as we continue to get more data around the country.
Great.
I would add also that folks with family history of anaphylaxis and less severe vaccine reactions don't have to hesitate to get the vaccine according to the ACIP.
Okay, great. So let's move to the next question then. What is, Heather, you already kind of touched on this a little bit, so maybe just want to expand. What is causing the allergic reaction, anaphylaxis, that has been seen rarely? Do we know what's causing it?
I mean, I would say we don't know. I would say that allergists are hypothesizing that it's the polyethylene glycol component of the lipid nanoparticle in both the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. That could potentially be the source, although I think that, there's no preservatives in either vaccine, but there's a lot of components. There's different sucrose components and obviously the mRNA, but some different buffers and things like that. And different parts, there's cholesterol and different things in the nanoparticle that could potentially be the source. There's a limited list of characteristics that you can find on the internet or particles that are in the vaccine itself. But I think the polyethylene glycol is the leading culprit, I would say, at this time. Glenn or Dan, anything?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, actually, this sounds like it's an off-topic point, but I promise I'll come right back around here in a second. The mRNA vaccines have been in development for over a decade. Not this specific vaccine, but the concept of using them. And two of the benefits of them are that they're fairly straightforward to make. It's not a surprise, therefore, that both the Pfizer and the Moderna RNA vaccines are the first ones that are getting licensed for use, but also because they're among the safest. And they're safe because they lack any of the preservatives that are necessary to keep, let's say, a replication competent attenuated vaccine or a inactivated virus particle intact long enough for it to be able to induce an immune response. So relative to other vaccines, the RNA vaccines are, as Heather points out, preservative free and should be pretty innocuous for the vast majority of recipients.
Dan, did you have a comment before we move to the next question?
Nothing more to add, no.
Okay, great. Then looks like, okay, there it is. Another question that's been coming from patients to physicians: what if I am pregnant or nursing a newborn? Should I avoid the vaccine? What's the best advice for those patients?
So I'll start, and then Heather and Glenn, feel free to contribute. What we know is that no pregnant women were included in the first trials, and therefore there is no data technically on these trials. What we have seen is a number of institutions and a number of national societies come out with statements in favor of supporting people who want to make the decision for vaccination. So ACOG is one of those, and the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine has also come out and strongly supported the pregnant woman's ability to choose and weigh risk benefit with their providers. And so it should not be viewed as a contraindication. Once again, this is a non-live vaccine. And so it's something where discussions could be made based on the environment in which that pregnant woman might be living or working as well. And so those types of factors might play in. So that's really where it is at the moment, is a conversation. Again, definitely not a contraindication, but something that you should discuss with your doctors, and absolutely with MFM. In terms of newborns, at this point, there's no evidence that mRNA would be transmitted through breast milk. And as Glenn had mentioned earlier, mRNA is not going to be it's not going to be viable for very long. And so the thinking there is that once again, no lactating women were in these studies, but there's a favoring of weighing the risk and benefit for this situation as well.
Well, I think we're ready to move to the next question then. What is the effect of the vaccine on diagnostic testing? Will I get a positive COVID test after the vaccine? This is probably something that the patients have been asking their doctors a lot, is, sometimes flu symptoms manifest after a flu vaccine. There's been reported side effects of feeling like you have COVID for about 24 hours, but is there a separate line of questioning that comes with the testing? Will it give you a positive test after a vaccine? Do we know?
So depends on what we mean by testing. So if you get a PCR test after getting the vaccine, either one or both doses, there is no way in which you will test positive by PCR because of the vaccine. So if you have a positive PCR test that is looking for RNA, that the virus, that's the viral genetic material, that's because you have the infection, not as a consequence of the vaccine. Nobody uses antibody testing as diagnostic, at least I don't believe that those are used as diagnostic, but certainly if you were to be tested for the presence of antibodies post-vaccine, then yes, of course you would end up having them, because that's the whole goal of the vaccination process. But no, you should not have a positive COVID test as a consequence of the vaccine.
I would add that, the antibody test that I'm aware of doesn't parse out. You should have, after the vaccine immunity, you should have spike protein antibody. After natural immunity from infection, you should have antibodies to different facets of the SARS-CoV-2. At this point, I'm not aware that our lab differentiates those. So I do think it would be the same. I think it would be a positive test after vaccination versus just natural infection.
Right, I agree. And I'm unaware that there are tests that actually say, X% of your IgG responses to spike versus some different percent to a different protein. I agree. Right now, they're just looking for the totality of neutralizing antibody responses to SARS.
All right, I think we're ready for the next question then. What are the side effects? How frequently do they occur? And a specific question for our internal audience: should I report these side effects using the HGE app?
Dan, they heard my spiel on side effects. Do you
Sure.
want to offer yours?
Yeah, absolutely. So side effects are common. And if there's anything I can summarize, it's that probably 80% or more of patients who received the vaccine got some sort of reaction to it. Most of them were very mild, and most of them involved some soreness of the arm, right? But most people got something. In some cases, that was a pretty more severe, like this is much different than influenza vaccination kind of thing. So people can really get a sore arm from it. But the things that I would also like to have the group think about is the fatigue part, the headaches part. Those things are a little harder to parse out over the day-to-day symptoms, and it actually occurred in many patients who received placebo dosing, but it's occurred in a significantly higher number of people that received the vaccine. And what is remarkable, and not necessarily surprising, is that those numbers of side effects went up for the second dose. And so after the first dose, very few people had fevers, maybe 4% if I remember the correct quote, and a not insignificant number with headaches, myalgias, fatigue. But after the second dose, we were in the teens in terms of percentage of people who had fevers, and the fatigue reached the 60% mark. Headaches, the malaise kinds of feelings. So people feel pretty crummy after this. And we should be this is helpful to know because it's something that we can be counseling our patients on in advance. It's important that they know that this isn't the virus attacking them at this point after dose 2. This is their immune system doing this, and that's a good thing. But it's something that it's important that we're able to share with our patients up front so that they expect it. That's the key. And the second dose, much more severe than the first dose in general.
And I would add that the side effects were short-lived relatively.
Yes.
1 to 3 days, everything was better. So that's some comfort to folks who are feeling kind of crummy after the vaccine.
I'll just add one thing as a way of, I don't think this is for this particular audience, but it's a way of perhaps educating some of the folks that you might be interacting with. I've done now had a lot of conversations with, let's say, nurses stations and with individuals about their anxieties about getting the vaccine. And while we all would recognize that waking up, let's say in the middle of the night with a little bit of arm soreness, maybe low-grade fever that a naproxen or a couple of Advil will get rid of, is a good sign. That is an indication that your immune response is effectively being generated against this vaccine. One can imagine that there are individuals who might see this as a fearful outcome, right? That they might be like, oh my gosh, this vaccine has given me COVID or has caused something else. So being candid about the side effects without overstating them, yes, they're transient and they're, for the vast majority of people, quite mild, but that it's also an indication that, it's successful, that you are mounting an immune response, and the consequence of that immune response is the production of cytokines that are going to make you feel transiently unwell. But that's a good thing.
I would add for the Temple folks in the audience, you can and should report the side effects using the HGE app. If there's concern that you may be actually developing early COVID before your vaccine has taken full effect, the COVID exposure response group should hear from you via email, and also will track you on the HGE app as well.
And if I can, I think I used the word more severe the second time, but what I should say is more pronounced in terms of general population. Severe is not the correct term there, so I wanted to correct myself. The other thing I want to add on this is outside of the HGE app, the CDC is offering the ability for you to give them your side effects. So there's a program called V-Safe that is, it's a website that you can go to. And so after vaccination, you or your patients can enroll in this. And then what it does is it's going to send you a message every day to report your symptoms, and it's check boxes. So it can be done on the computer or on your smartphone. It's easy to use, looks really nice. And so that's another way that we can all actually help our future patients by reporting our own side effect profile as we go through the vaccines.
Hey,
They
Jeremy,
text you every day. They text you every day for a week. It's not every day for the rest of your life or anything. It's every day for a week, and then
Thank you.
once every couple of weeks after that.
Yeah, not forever.
Jeremy, before we go on to the next question, I just want to spot check myself on something I said. So I've been looking at some of the questions that have come up in the chat. I realized that we're saving some of those, but there was a question that came up that said, is it okay to take an anti-inflammatory like, a couple of Advil? My understanding is that that is a perfectly acceptable thing to do, that in no way would taking something that's going to just reduce some of the, the myalgia that you might have would in any way counteract the effect of the vaccine. But I just want to make sure. Oh, there we go.
You anticipated the next question, Glenn, but this is
Did
good.
I?
Keep
Well,
going.
I forgot what the questions were, but I want to make sure that that is the recommendation that both Dan and Heather would recommend here.
My
Now
understanding
that we
is
have the
that
question
there
up on
was
the
at
screen.
Thanks. My understanding is that there was at least a conversation at the FDA and ACIP level about not recommending pre-medication with NSAID due to the theoretical possibility that it would decrease reaction, but post, once you get a side effect, that for the myalgia, for the headache, whatever, that it would be fine.
Right, good. So right, not pre-medication, but because post, once you have the myalgia, in a sense, immunologically, the horse has already, left the barn, right? I mean, you're already actively making that immune response. And I cannot envision that a small, OTC dose of whatever it is going to have any kind of impact on the full induction of a host response.
I think that's right.
That's right. And keep in mind the other piece of it is the symptomatic benefit of these only lasts 4 to 6 hours. And by the time symptoms develop is usually from the vaccine is usually about 12 to 24 hours in. So no reason to pre-medicate.
All right, great. Let's go ahead and look at the next question. How likely is Bell's palsy or Guillain-Barré syndrome as a result of the vaccine?
Do you want me to take a crack at this?
Sure.
So, so there was no Guillain-Barré seen in the timing of the follow-up in either trial. So that's the first thing. I think Guillain-Barré is something that is on the screening panel of questions that you get before you get really most vaccines. But there were 0 cases in the trials. In terms of Bell's palsy, there was a handful of cases, 4 versus 0, 3 versus 1 in the 2 trials. And I think that that might be a tiny bit higher than the background rate of Bell's palsy. I think that FDA and VSafe and all the places that are tracking adverse effects, the companies themselves are looking for more signal here, but sort of too early to conclude definitively. Certainly it did happen a couple times.
I did take a look for the background rate, like you said, Heather, in the general community of Bell's palsy, and it looks like it's on the rate of about 1 out of 10,000 individuals, and which is about where we are with the vaccinations in terms of Moderna plus Pfizer. So we're in about 45,000 vaccinated. Excuse me, and at this point further now in terms of those that have been vaccinated in the community. And we've seen a total of 7 cases amongst these trials. So FDA said, just like you did, Heather, we're going to continue to monitor, but we can't make a definitive statement that this is being caused by the vaccine. And I recently saw an update in terms of Guillain-Barré and the actual, native coronavirus virus itself, and there's no association or link that's been found.
All right, then let's move to the next question. Will these vaccines decrease asymptomatic spread of COVID-19?
Can I take a crack at this one to start? So this is actually a really important question, and one that we don't yet have an answer to. So what we know, as Heather pointed out right at the start, is that these vaccines are remarkably successful in preventing disease, that is, preventing COVID. What we don't know is whether they prevent infection with the SARS coronavirus. So it is possible that a vaccinated individual exposed to COVID exposed to SARS, I want to use my language correctly here, exposed to SARS out in the wild there, could potentially get infected, but because of the immune response that they've generated to the vaccine, show no signs whatsoever. But for that transient period that they are infected, potentially they could become a spreader. They could give it to other individuals. That is plausible. A couple of things to kind of counterbalance this point. First, if this were true, and it's possible, if this were true, then one would imagine that the amount of virus that a vaccinated individual would shed would be substantially less than an actually infected individual, because we know that things like coughing and sneezing, some of the consequences of the disease, COVID, help to expel lots of extracellular virus progeny. So even if a vaccinated person still was infected, presumably they're not going to be shedding much, if any, extracellular particles. But this is also the reason why vaccinated individuals continue to need to wear masks, right? Because the mask wearing is all part of the prophylaxis, just on the off chance that you might still be susceptible, or that for whatever reason you fall into that 5% of individuals that's vaccinated that nevertheless still gets a mild case of COVID. That still is to be determined from a scientific perspective.
I would add that in the FDA documents that Moderna submitted, they did do PCR in all folks who showed up for the second, well, all of them did, for the day 28 vaccine for the second dose of Moderna. And there were 14 folks in the vaccine arm versus 38 folks in the placebo arm who had asymptomatic infection at that time. 28 days after one dose of vaccine, for whatever that's worth. It wasn't an endpoint of the trial. You can't really draw conclusions on it, though I think people want to draw conclusions on it because of how important it would be to decrease transmission.
Okay. All right, I think we'll go to the next question then. Is Temple aware of any pediatric vaccine trials that are taking place?
I don't personally know of any that are happening on this campus, but both Pfizer and Moderna are planning vaccination campaigns in children after this. So I was able to take a peek and see. It looks like Pfizer has registered on clinical trials to do 12 to 18-year-olds, and I believe Moderna had as well. I don't know when the younger children are going to be enrolled. I would imagine that the answer would be yes, and they'll go incrementally in age group downward, but making sure that it's safe for the older children first. And it does seem, from that high school students seem to be transmitting it more than the elementary school students. So hopefully this is an area of higher need. I mean, I'm not speaking to too many pediatricians now, so maybe that statement is incorrect, but 12 to 18 looks like the next group.
All right, I think we're ready for the next question then. So what obligations do I have as an academic and a physician to be an ambassador for this vaccine? And what advice can you offer me on this? Basically, they're all asking, how can they be you? I think is what that question is. So we'll go ahead and let everybody answer this one. Glenn, you want to start?
Me?
Yes, we'll start. Just on my screen, it goes Glenn, Dan, and Heather. So Glenn, you go first, then Dan, then Heather.
Sure. So I think a couple of points, and if I may be permitted to give advice to those who are listening. First of all, people have concerns about this vaccine. They have concerns because this has been a ridiculous, confusing, terrifying year, and because there is a lack of understanding about what a vaccine is, distinctly different from medicine. So I often will make a point to say medicine treats a pre-existing condition, vaccinations are preventative. You can't overdose on the vaccine the way that you can on a med, for example. And their questions are legitimate. They worry that vaccines have been rushed. They worry that they don't understand what the RNA does, hence why that was the first question of the series here. But these people aren't anti-vaxxers. So first, really importantly, don't put them into that category, right? There are people who are very much opposed to the MMR vaccine, either for themselves or for their children. They are adamant, let's use a gentle word for them, and they believe that vaccines are wholly wrong and are, sort of government mandates and conspiracies. The folks that you might encounter that have questions aren't them. So first, my piece of advice is moderate your language as to how you characterize individuals that have bona fide questions. Secondly, and then I promise I'll stop my little lecturing here, I've done a fair number of visits up here at Fox Chase. I actually have 2 this afternoon, and over at Gene's, talking to small groups of individuals, like nursing stations or the respiratory therapists, for example, who just want to have their questions answered by somebody who knows what they're talking about. And so my advice would be, don't lecture them. Ask what their questions and concerns are. Ask whether they want your perspective. These vaccines are not being mandated, and so therefore people have the right to say, you know what, for my own reasons, my own personal reasons, I'm going to decline the vaccine, and that is acceptable. So your job is not necessarily to twist their arm and persuade them to get the vaccine. Your job is to initiate a conversation with them to find out what their concerns are. And if you can address those concerns, maybe even mitigate those concerns, then you might change minds. So be ambassadors is my final point here is if you've decided for yourself to get a vaccine, tell other people in your orbit, right? Because people will trust folks that they know. And I think what we're going to begin to see is that the pendulum after the new year, as more and more people get vaccinated and as fewer and fewer side effects are reported from those vaccines, more and more folks are going to start to want them because they're seeing their own family members or neighbors or whoever get vaccinated and now be on the safe side of this infection. And it is through that slow process of compelling individual by individual that we're finally going to put this awfulness behind us. But enough of us need to do it to reach that critical threshold. So again, sorry for the lecturing here on this, but I think we do have opportunity to change minds here for folks that might have some legitimate questions about the process or about the vaccine itself.
Dan?
I agree. I think that it's best to be collaborative here as we know that it's new territory. I think the more information that we can give to our patients, the better in terms of, you know, and being able to guide them. You know, today may not be the day that they're ready to take it, but maybe in a week or two, if they talk to some people, they will. So remembering that it's not a decision to force people into or feel like they're coerced into. The more we can persuade without feeling coercive, the better when it comes to situations like these. Depending on the communities that we're all serving here, there's a lot of mistrust of vaccines, and for good reasons from previous history with the way that vaccinations and other types of trials have taken place. And so, in order to overcome some of that fear and worry, sometimes it's going to take talking to their family members who have already gotten it, right? So if a few people get it and tell their friends, right, sometimes that goes further than even me saying something about it, so I'm happy to say that I agree with Glenn that, like, for those of us that take the vaccine when it's available to us, tell other people what you experienced. Make sure that it gets normalized, that this is something that is part of us staying safe and protecting each other. And for some, the argument's going to be maybe you don't think that you need it for you, but what about grandma? And sometimes that's the answer for them, is it's not really going to be that they need it for their own safety if they're in like a younger age demographic, perhaps. Although we know that severe disease can still happen in those groups. But maybe it's for their loved one. So it may be certain things like that. So be gentle. There's probably good reasons as to why they're hesitant, as Glenn said. But you can share information with them, and you can be champions through that.
Heather, give you the last word before we get to the crowd questions.
Wow, the last word. So I guess I would talk about change management as a philosophy. And so right now we're in the phase where, healthcare workers are the only folks being offered the vaccine mostly. And so they're, we're considered early adopters of a change that is coming. And there's like waves of folks behind us who are really content to be not the first ones at the front of getting this new vaccine for all the reasons Dan and Glenn so nicely articulated. And so I guess I would say to offer patience and grace, and the way we change anything is sort of big picture and then micro. So big picture, there's, social media influencers. And if you're not an Instagram influencer, you can still have conversations with your family and with your friends and be there to answer questions and even offer, hey, are you thinking about the vaccine? Would you like to ask me any questions? And keep up to date as much as possible on some of the important issues that folks are having concerns about. And so, you can be an influencer on social media or in your life, but then you can also have one-on-one conversations and really move the needle that way. And a lot of one-on-one conversations can really multiply to get this thing done for us to return to some normalcy in 21.
Well, thanks. That's a good place to stop with our pre-prepared questions. Thank you to the panelists for their participation, for the audience for hanging in this long. We got a number of questions in the chat, and we're not going to be able to get to all of them. But the nice thing is that the three panelists are your colleagues, and they're around, and I'm sure they'd be happy to talk to you whenever they can make time. But I did want to get to a couple that I thought were really important. One of them was a clarifying question about the flu vaccine and the COVID vaccine. You said don't get the flu vaccine and the COVID vaccine close together, but the question was, what about between the initial shot and the booster? They can't get the flu vaccine in that time frame either?
Well, for the Pfizer vaccine, I don't think there would be a 14-day window to get the flu vaccine in between day 21 and day 1, that is 14 days apart from both. So as a general rule, I would say to not do that in between. I don't know if Glenn or Dan have any other opinion. That's mine.
Maybe, sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, I'm not going to disagree with this advice. I'm a PhD scientist, not a physician, so I will absolutely defer. But from an immunological perspective, because the immune responses that you're making to influenza versus to the spike protein of coronavirus are independent processes. I think it makes sense to sort of separate out away from other vaccinations for this period of time, simply because this is a new virus, it's a new vaccine. So I certainly endorse and support the conservative strategy and approach. But I think if, let's say, someone were to get infected with the flu in between these two doses, where you'll now be making an immune response to the actual infection, it would not cause me, if this were me or a loved one of mine, it wouldn't cause me great concern or alarm that somehow having had a previous COVID or SARS vaccine would somehow interfere or make the flu worse or vice versa. So just from a science perspective, I'm not entirely sure that there's a huge risk here to avoid anything around that period of time of the COVID vaccines.
And as many of you are well aware, we give multiple doses of vaccines, in the same visit often, right? Because we are comfortable with that. They think about kids, we put 4 vaccines in one and then we give them 2 other ones. So they get like 7 different things inoculated at once, right? So we have history of that. And I think that probably someday we'll get there as well. That's exactly right though, Glenn. I think they're keeping it separate on purpose so that we know what the symptoms and side effects of the vaccines are. So you can tease that out. If something happens to somebody, you don't want to be in a case where it's like, was this the flu shot? Was this another virus? Was this the COVID vaccine? So I think for that reason alone, we should be separating those things. Right now is a good time to get everybody vaccinated for flu if they haven't already, because we can't get the COVID vaccines to the general public yet. So get the flu shots now.
So one question that came in is, what does the data on vaccine retrogenicity look like? What do we know about that? Do we have data on that yet?
I'm not entirely sure I understand that vaccine reactogenicity. Heather, does that—
Retrogenicity was the word that came through. Retrogenicity?
I'm looking at the question. Reactogenicity is the word that was used here.
Okay, that's probably correct, because that question may have been auto-corrected on the text, sorry.
So Heather, do you know what that question might be referring to?
Dr. Kelson, you're on still, I think.
Yeah, that generally refers in the literature to the side effect of the medication, the nature of the side effects and the severity. And I guess I asked the question about reactogenicity in people who had prior COVID-19 and then got the vaccine. But then, Heather, I think you subsequently said none of those people who had clinical COVID-19 were allowed into the Pfizer and Moderna trial. So we don't really know. And I raised that question because in pulmonary, anecdotally, we've had half a dozen or so pulmonologists who had clinical COVID-19 who got the Pfizer vaccine last week who've had significant side effects. I mean, they fall within the spectrum of what's been described, but compared to the majority of us who did not have COVID-19, it seemed like it was sort of a significantly different and much greater response, reactogenicity to the vaccine. But that's anecdotal.
I mean, I think I have heard that anecdotally as well, and I would say that, you know, I guess until we can study it in more detail, you know, I think report the adverse effects or the side effects to be safe, and you know, hopefully on that. I haven't been through the screening yet, but they ask you if you've had COVID prior. That would be really interesting to know, because I do think it's possible, for the same reasons that the symptoms are more prevalent with the second dose of vaccine. That, you know, if you can say your first hit, quote unquote, was the first infection with SARS-CoV-2, and then the
Yep.
vaccine being number 2, it maybe makes sense to me, but I don't know that we have data about it yet.
Well, from an immune perspective, it seems to me to make very much sense, because you're giving this vaccine in someone who's had, let's say, COVID-19. You would expect to get an anamnestic response, and with cytokine release, a pro-inflammatory effect. So I'd be very surprised if you didn't get more of a reaction, self-limited, if you previously had COVID-19. And if you've had, on the first injection, 103 fever that lasted for 4 days and you felt absolutely awful, I would be very loath to recommend the second dose in the series 3 weeks later. I'd sort of, my reaction would be wait some length of time until it looks like your antibody levels at least have gone down from some sky high level. And by the way, to my reading of the literature on these vaccines, they are producing at least antibody levels that are several orders of magnitude higher than what's observed in convalescent serum in people who've recovered from symptomatic COVID-19. That's one of the great news stories of this vaccine, that they outperform the disease itself at least in terms of antibodies. We don't know about the Th1 responses.
Stephen, thank you for that. I
Yep.
think you're right that we have to take a look at it for those that had symptomatic COVID.
Yep.
I will tell you, for Moderna and for Pfizer, in the FDA briefings that they made public, you can actually take a look and see what the differences in reactions were for those who were baseline antibody positive versus antibody negative. And across the board, there were fewer side effects reported for those that were antibody positive when they reported that. So that's quite different as well. So
Yep.
thinking about it, you know, for those, when they ask people specifically, you know, did you have a local, you know, soreness in your arm? Like 90% of those that were naive reported it, but only about 78% of those who had antibodies reported it. So there was actually lower side effects from the vaccine in that category. So again, further discussion probably needed.
All right, so it's 1 o'clock, which is our designated stop time. We had a number of questions come in on the chat, but like I said, I think we want to be respectful of everybody's time. So on behalf of the Temple University Health System, I'm going to thank again our panelists for their time in answering some of these questions that are coming up, and to our audience members for hanging on. Really a very productive discussion, and we will be back with more of these videos and hopefully address some of the questions that came through as well. So thank you everyone for your participation.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.